Southern California was home to many of the large aviation firms. In 1928, over 20 airframe and aircraft engine manufacturers were located in Southern California. In addition, LA in this area opened 53 landing fields within 30 miles of City Hall, one of which, Mines Field, is now current-day LAX. At the height of the Cold War, 15 of the largest 25 aviation manufacturers were in Southern California. But aviation manufacturers in Torrance? Well, you probably think of Robinson helicopters. But they weren't the first. In fact, they weren't even the second. Let's find out more about the early aviation manufacturers in Torrance on PCZ TV. PCZ TV. Let's start with the airfield. In 1939, the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads purchases a portion of the old Weston Ranch. The site was to become part of a transportation experiment to encourage the air transportation industry. In 1941, following Pearl Harbor, all civil aviation within 200 miles of the Pacific coast was shut down. And in 1942, the U.S. Corps of Engineers took over the airstrip, adding barracks and other military buildings, and the Lomita Flight Strip was born. It would become an important training facility for P-38 and P-51 fighter pilots, and was heavily used from 1942 and 1944. Now, if folks are unhappy about aircraft noise now, imagine back then with all those extremely loud fighters flying around. By the way, is there any sound in the universe as good as those big World War II aircraft engines? Nope. In 1946, the field was given to the city of Torrance and renamed Zamperini Field. And take a look around it. Just oil derricks and empty fields back then. Amazing. So let's take a look at the manufacturers. And just to clarify, I'm only going to chat about manufacturers of aircraft, not subcontractors or subassemblies, and only focus on those that use Zamperini. Otherwise, we'd be here all day. So, who was first? The first was Edmund R. Doak. Not exactly a household name in aviation. He was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1898, but moved to California in 1910. He worked for a lot of the local aviation firms, such as Douglas Aircraft, Bell Aircraft, North American Aviation. And in 1939, Doak formed Doak Aircraft Company. And in 1940, Doak Aircraft and the company opened its Torrance plant at 2321 Abalone Avenue. Now, he had foreseen the possibility that steel might be in a premium. And with the possibility also of America's entrance in the war, he began working with aluminum and molded plywood and built a trainer, the DRD-1, out of plywood for both military and civilian use. However, once World War II started, he began manufacturing wood and metal components for larger planes as a subcontractor. At one time, he had as many as 4,000 employees, most of them women, the largest employer in Torrance. Now, he remained a subcontractor after the end of World War II, but he had always been fascinated by helicopters, and he puzzled over an idea that would combine a helicopter's small landing space with an airplane's capacity for longer and faster forward flying. So he started working on a ducted fan-powered plane, winning some patents in the process. Essentially, he preceded the concept of the Osprey by half a century. In 1954, his company began developing the idea in earnest, and they used Zamperini as their home base. In 1956, the Army announced the award of a contract for the development of an experimental VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing plane, in Doak 1. Over the next 2 years, Doak worked on developing the prototype plane, which the company called the Doak Model 16 at its hangars at Torrance Municipal Airport, and ground testing began in Torrance in 1958. The Doak Model 16 successfully completed its first free hovery flight at the airport, impressing the Army officials. The plane was then moved to Edwards Air Force Base and further testing in 1958. Later, in 1959, the Army announced the acceptance of the plane and renamed it the VZ-4 and moved it to NASA facilities in Maryland. Now, Doak envisioned not only military but also civilian use for his creation, telling the Daily Breeze that ducted propeller aircraft of this type, vertical takeoff, long-range, high-speed, can provide a commercial feeder to carry traffic between a few major landing fields and some smaller outlying cities having no huge jet-age airports. It was a grand idea that could have revolutionized commercial aviation, but it never came to pass. The Army and NASA continued to test the VZ-4 until 1960, when the U.S. Congress stepped in and said, henceforth the Air Force would develop airplanes and the Army helicopters. Well, the VZ-4 was classified as a plane, but the Air Force wasn't really interested. They didn't even invite Doak to bid into its VTOL competition. Now, Doak Aircraft had lost its only major customer. It had no further prospects of developing a dream plane. Disillusioned, Doak closed the company in 1960, and in 1961 sold all the patent rights and engineering files to Douglas Aircraft in nearby Long Beach. So now you're thinking, now is Robinson. You'd be thinking wrong. The next manufacturer, Zamperini, is Acme. Now this totally sounds like a Roadrunner gag, but it's not. It's actually Acme Aircraft. Acme Aircraft started after the war around 1948 by Hugh Crawford and Roger Keeney. Now they later changed the name in 1953 to Sierradyne. I wonder why. But they began modifying and building aircraft, including experimental racers in Torrance. Now, note the Nike missile base in the background. And for a video on the Nike base in Rancho Palos Verdes, watch this video. And we're back! Anyway, I mentioned earlier that I was focusing only on aircraft builds and not modifications, so I won't go into detail on the Acme conversions, which were called the Acme Centaur 101 and 102. What's really interesting is their original design, the Acme Sierra. It was built in late 1948, the first flight in 1953, and is built according to Goodyear racing plane specifications, although it never entered any race. It was later used by Northrop in the 1960s to test and promote boundary layer control concepts, although it was never officially a Northrop plane. So Acme, or Sierradyne, sort of faded from the scene shortly thereafter. I can't find any information on their current status or what happened to them. Like many aerospace companies, there were a lot of mergers and acquisitions over the years, so who knows, maybe we just swallowed up by one of the biggies. And speaking of which, it's time for Then and Now. The Doak Torrance plant is roughly at 223rd Street in Western and is now essentially a Lowe's hardware store. The sole VZ-4 was withdrawn from the Army inventory, was tested by NASA, but they put it in the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in 1973. There is a ducted fan impeller at Zamperini Field that I, of course, forgot to take a photo of when I was there. However, I did remember that the Acme Sierra is hanging in the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance, California, and we're watching some video of it. And that's it. I'm not aware of any other remaining doak or Acme aircraft still in existence. If you know of any, put it in the comments below. A great resource for the Torrance Airport is this book, and a great in-depth series of videos on the doak VZ is in this video series here, and I am indebted to both for great information. If you've been watching this far, I thank you. Bye!